Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Casey Baum. I hope that you're all having a wonderful weekend. Today is Sunday, August 30th, and I've got a very exciting show for you, a pretty interesting show. I thought it'd be fun to do some, more, childhood-related movies, because the new movie that I checked out this week was Phineas and Ferb, Candace Against The Universe. I was kind of excited for it. I thought it was a fun little addition to the Phineas and Ferb universe as a whole. I thought it'd be a fun watch. I also just finished Avatar: The Last Airbender, the show, recently, because for some reason I just never watched that as a kid. I don't know why. And so I thought it would be fitting to try the movie. I knew what I was getting myself into, and I'm sure that you guys know what you're getting yourself into as well. So that's the second movie. That's my weekly watch. And I couldn't really think of something that I wanted to recommend. I was trying to find something that kind of fit, based on a children's show or a show that I watched as a kid. And there were definitely some ideas that I had, but it just so happened that I'm now in school. So I'm a film student again, and I attended an online presentation from one of my school's alumni, Gary Doberman, who actually wrote the screenplay for It, and I love that movie. And so it's a little bit of a wild card for this episode. It's obviously not a kid's movie, but it does surround a lot of young kids, and I think it's a really fun movie to recommend. And so that's my little, it's a little bit different than I usually do. It's not quite as related as it normally would be, but I got to listen to the screenwriter talk about the movie a little bit, so I thought it'd be a fun thing to talk about. And then finally, the last segment for this episode is going to be my top 5 Disney Channel original movies of all time. I'm a huge sucker for those things. They're super fun. I watched a bunch with a few of my friends recently, and I thought it'd be fun to run down a very subjective list, because not all of them are quality all the time, but I thought it'd be a fun thing to talk about. So that is today's episode. I hope that you are all excited, and let's get started. Alright, so Phineas and Ferb, Candace Against The Universe is a brand new movie streaming right now on Disney+. It came out this past Friday. It's a continuation of sorts of Phineas and Ferb, but it's supposed to kind of take place before the finale. I think the creators described it as a lost episode, more or less. It basically follows Candace and the entire crew, all of the recognizable characters, but Candace in particular, as she gets abducted by aliens and is the chosen one on an alien planet, while Phineas and Ferb and the gang have to go and save her. So it's a pretty interesting premise. I was pretty excited for it. Maybe I wasn't extremely excited for it. I was mostly just curious, and I think that has to do with the fact that Phineas and Ferb has been off the air for 5 years, and in 2015, and it didn't end unceremoniously. It got a finale. People tended to really like the finale. I think it ended on its own terms, and so bringing it back for a movie, I was definitely curious as to what that was going to be, why they were going to do it. I think a lot of times if something is going to get rebooted in a sense like that, because there's no indication that this is going to be a continuation for any other sort of show or movie or anything, there should be a reason for it, right? And I think ultimately that was my main problem with this movie. I liked it overall. I think it's fun. It's enjoyable. It's sort of like a cute, harmless movie to watch with your family, with some friends if you want to. But ultimately, it doesn't really seem like it serves any purpose to continuing the Phineas and Ferb story that ended pretty concisely. It doesn't seem to offer any new information to us. A lot of the themes that are explored here as far as within that universe are things that have been explored in previous episodes. I mean, this thing ran for 8 years or so, 7 years. So it told a lot of different stories. And I think a lot of the things that it's trying to convey here are things that have already been conveyed in the show. And this is just sort of like upping the ante a little bit. So I think it's enjoyable. I don't think it really has all that much to say. It doesn't really have all that much to add to it. And so I can start kind of with the directing this time, because that's really my only sort of like critique of the directing. Because in 2D animation like this, particularly one, I mean, that's based on a television show, there isn't really the central vision of one director, at least in my understanding. I apologize if that is offensive to anybody who is a director of 2D animation, but as far as I know, it's much more of a collaborative process in that way, and particularly for this one, it's directed by Bob Bowen, who has written and been kind of art consultant and directed a couple other TV shows like Family Guy, American Dad, but he was not involved in Phineas and Ferb, the television show, so he contributed to the screenplay, directed this, but he's not one of the creators. It's not necessarily his vision. So the fact that it's directed by somebody else and that it's a show that's been off the air for a long time and it doesn't seem to add anything all that interesting to everything, I don't really see a purpose for this movie. The only thing that I can really see is that Disney Plus wanted something, a new original Disney Channel movie to kind of launch things, because they're still a pretty new streaming service. They still want some content, and particularly a lot of their content is older content, like a lot of TV shows and movies that people probably have already seen or are a little bit like older for young kids that have Disney Plus. So the other kind of suspicion that I have is this is a movie that the studio execs at Disney wanted to kind of put out there so that younger kids who may not have seen Phineas and Ferb or seen only a part of it might find this movie really entertaining and then want to go back and watch the rest of the show, so then they'll subscribe to Disney Plus. Maybe that's a cynical way of looking at it. I don't necessarily see it as all that much of a bad thing. Disney Plus is a streaming service that wants to put out their own content. Using some of their other properties is perfectly fine. The creators were involved in this project because a lot of them do voice acting on the show. So I don't see this as a bad thing by any means. I just don't really see a point to it all that much. But that being said, let's get into just kind of like the nitty gritty of the movie, because overall I did enjoy it. I thought it was fun. It's pretty well structured. It's got like that pretty traditional 3 acts. You've got a really nice setup. And then a lot of it takes place, it's like the second act kind of takes place in space, and then the third act has this really big climax. And I actually really like the climax. I think it's really clever. It escalates things really nicely. It also has a really cute finale. I think my favorite moment was sort of the heart of the movie, and it's supposed to be kind of the Pixar gut punch. It's not obviously like super emotional for the type of movie that it is, but it's definitely very cute. I thought it had a pretty nice message, even if it is kind of a predictable message. The whole movie is pretty light. The stakes are never all that high. And so it's like not something that's going to turn anybody off from this movie. And it's sort of like the correct amount of stakes for a movie like this. So a lot of it is like seemingly in a different kind of movie, these types of events would be very high stakes. It's end of the world, but that's the kind of thing that happens in almost every episode of Phineas and Ferb. So having it work in this movie, the stakes are kind of right at the level they need to be. I also mentioned how I like how well structured this movie is. The beginning, the first act, sets up a lot of things really nicely for the rest of the movie. So there's different like thematic things that come back. There's different like literal things that come back. There are a few things that like the setup is pretty obvious, or that the setup comes pretty quickly before the reveal of it. So like there's one little gag here. It's like the chicken-inator or something. It's one of Doofenshmirtz's toys, and I kind of wanted that to come back like way later. It was sort of like a good gag, and it tends to come back pretty quickly, and they actually use it fairly often throughout it. I thought that would have been a much funnier gag if it came back at the very end. Instead, they do that with another thing that's brought onto the spaceship. That's much more obvious of a setup, and so I just thought that was a little bit predictable. That one probably would have been more interesting if that was used more often than the more creative one was used at the very end, but that's just a nitpick. Because a lot of this, too, is that this is a movie made for kids. Like, it's a movie made for 7 to 12, maybe even younger than that, for families. And so I can kind of nitpick this thing. I think there are definitely some things that it could have improved on to be better for an entire audience. But still, that's not the kind of movie it is. So I know that. If you think this is a little bit too critical, a little bit too analytical for your taste, I totally understand that. But I do kind of want to just review this from an objective, or as objective as possible, a movie standpoint. And so these are the kind of movies that overall I do really enjoy if they're made really well. And I think even if their target audience is younger, I think there are definitely ways to improve it so it's entertaining for everybody. There are a lot of examples of movies and television shows that do that. And some of the ways in which they do that happen on the show, because the show is actually pretty darn good for any age group. Like, it's aimed sort of, I would actually argue that this movie is aimed a little bit younger than the show is ultimately aimed for almost all the time. I think the show is kind of aimed for like 10 to 15, 7 to 15 maybe, and then this one's aimed like a little bit younger, but I think that kind of has to go with my theory of it being more for a new audience. But even still, if you watch Phineas and Ferb, like, I watched an episode after the movie because I was curious to see how different it was. And the show actually holds up really well. It's really quick. It's really witty. Every episode is only like 10, 12 minutes, or every like little adventure. So usually it's 2 packed on to one episode, but it's all one adventure that's kind of like 10 or 12 minutes. And I think that's another place where the movie lost me a little bit. Is one of the reasons I think Phineas and Ferb works so well is because it's these little adventures that are really concise. It's got its formula. The formula really works. It's entertaining. It's got some really fun jokes in the middle of it. Jokes that work for kids, but are also like kind of a little bit too intricate sometimes for kids to understand and just go over their heads. And so it's just like really smart comedy that a lot of people will find funny. And so in this one, I think the formula is still there. It's supposed to have that formula, but it just doesn't feel like it serves an hour and 30 minutes. Like, it's just something that could have probably been done in 30, maybe like a Phineas and Ferb special. But again, this is made way past the series finale, so this is sort of just like an add-on anyway. So sometimes it feels like a little bit slow. It doesn't really ever get boring, but there are some moments where you're like, okay, this isn't necessary. I don't really need this information, or this scene is going on, dragging on a little bit too long. And then also the jokes here I think are kind of 50-50. Early on, I didn't think any of them like fell all that much. And then there was a certain point where some of them started to click a lot more. I don't know if it was me becoming more in tune with the movie, or the jokes just like got a little bit funnier, got a little smarter. And I think that also comes down to there are a lot of jokes that probably get pitched, and then the best ones go into the 10 minutes, but this is not 10 minutes, it's an hour and a half, and so some of them just like don't fall as much. Whereas I think if you watch an average episode of Phineas and Ferb, most of those jokes are gonna get you. So that's just me. I think sometimes it gets a little bit slow. I don't think it necessarily needs to be an hour and a half, but it is, and even still, it is still entertaining for most of the ride. The acting is really solid because these characters, or these actors, have been playing these characters for 8 years. They're coming back to them. And so they have a really solid sense of who they are. I don't think there's any sort of like diversion from who they used to be, any big emotional climax for any of them, but that's not necessary. It's like, this is a movie with these characters. It's reintroducing the characters to a new audience in a sense. So I don't think it obviously needs to do that. There are some new performances too. Ali Wong plays one of the main characters, and so does Tiffany Haddish. And they're both really, really good. They don't necessarily have any reach for them. It's just sort of a fun role to say some fun lines. Neither of them have all that necessary like acting chops to pull this off, but that's not a bad thing. So they are definitely pretty good in this. As far as the production design goes, it's more of like character design, what a lot of these things look like. I thought the planet that they go to was really fun. I thought it was designed really well. The like city design is definitely nothing original. It kind of looks like what an alien city is supposed to look like, I guess, if that makes sense. They kind of do that in shows like this pretty often. It looks pretty similar. I thought they had a lot of fun with some of like the creature designs though. Like when they're walking to the planet, there's some fun little visual moments that are pretty quick, that you get to see the animators kind of playing around with what they want to do with some of these cool designs. That being said, some of the more main characters, like the main creatures, so there's like these dragon characters and then also the aliens, I think the designs are a little bit weak. The aliens in particular are pretty generic. There's nothing that kind of sets them apart from anything else. It's not, again, that's not necessarily something that this movie is trying to do. It's not trying to be subversive. But I definitely think they could have like upped it a little bit, made it a little bit more interesting. Moving on to the cinematography, that's just sort of like, Obviously, there's no cameras being involved, but it's what is being shown on screen. I think a lot of the shots are pretty expansive. They never really focus on one character. Usually the background is pretty open, pretty broad, so you get to see a lot of the like space that they're in. It's really colorful. You get to see all the really great animation. So I'm glad that they did that. They don't focus on any of the characters because there's a lot of characters in this that we've already established from the show, so there's no need to kind of establish them any further with sort of like more intricate character moments except for Candace, and she gets a few of those, but even those, it's not like tight on her face for any reason. It's showing the animation, and I think that's a good thing. I do wish, though, there had been a couple more, like, visual gags. One of my favorite things about animation is that you can have things going on in the background or even the foreground that are just, like, good comedy that doesn't need any dialogue. There really isn't any of that. There's a couple moments of it that tends to happen with Perry the Platypus because he can't talk, and he's supposed to be staying secret throughout this entire movie, but they really don't do it all that much. I wish they had played around with that more often. There is one moment that breaks the fourth wall that I do think is really funny. I think it goes on maybe a little bit too long, and maybe goes a little bit too far, but I do think that that joke was pretty good, and I did really like it. The editing, there's some really great comedic cuts. I think the scenes end right at the right time. Nothing overstays their welcome. Sometimes scenes will cut almost too quickly to like end towards the end of a joke as opposed to right after the joke has already ended. And I really like when that happens. It makes you like move right on to the next scene. So I liked that. There's a couple different plot lines, kind of. It's just that every character needs to be in this because it's the movie, so we need to have everybody. And so sometimes there are some plot lines that feel a little bit like unfocused or get dropped off. So, for example, Candace gets wrapped up and abducted with Vanessa, who's Doofenshmirtz's daughter, and she kind of like leaves the plot at a certain point and then comes back when it's necessary. So I think there are some things that are a bit unfocused. And sometimes the pacing can be a little bit slow just because it's stretching out a story that might not need to be that long. But overall, I think it's pretty solid. The sound, you can't talk about this movie without talking about the songs in it. Phineas and Ferb is known for having a song in every episode, and I think that usually works really well. They can like really focus on having one song that fits the plot. This one is like a musical, but it doesn't really work in the confines of what a musical should be. I think I talked about this in the Hamilton episode. Songs tend to pop up when the emotion of a scene is too grand, too big to just say, and I think in this case that isn't the case in this movie. They just kind of pop into song whenever they want to, whenever they think they can maybe make a joke out of it, and sometimes the jokes of the song aren't all that funny. The songs overall also aren't that memorable. There's nothing like that kind of sets it apart from any other song in Phineas and Ferb, and I would say that a lot of the songs in the Phineas and Ferb show are much better because they tend to play around with genre and the story a lot more than this one does. I do think that the final song of this movie is really conclusive. I think that one is definitely the best. There's also a song with Perry the Platypus that's kind of like a meta fourth wall breaking song that I thought was really funny. But other than those two, I don't think anything stands out all that much. They also tend to be like front loaded. A lot of the songs tend to be in the first, I would say, 40 minutes of this movie, and then there isn't really any songs, and then there's one at the end. So I would have wanted them to be a bit more spaced out, maybe a bit more focused on the emotional climax of a scene, and probably play around with the genre a bit more. So that's kind of everything. I know that I nitpicked this thing probably to hell, to a point where it's not really necessary for a movie that is like this, based on a kid's show. I would say it's a cash grab, but it's a streaming service, so if you already have the streaming service, you already have it. I don't think this is selling anybody on it. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe people are buying Disney Plus just for this. If that's the case, I wouldn't recommend that. If you already have Disney Plus and you're a fan of Phineas and Ferb, or even if you're not, I do think it's a fun ride. It's enjoyable. I would recommend watching the show first, though, or at least parts of the show, just so you're acquainted with the characters. I'm sure a lot of you have already seen the show, already know who they are. They're pretty popular. But even still, maybe watch an episode or two beforehand and then check this movie out, because I do think overall it's a pretty fun ride, even if it's not all that necessary. So because of that, I'm going to give this movie a strong 6 to a soft 7. Pretty good, pretty fun, but didn't need it all that much, and probably could have been improved in a couple places. So that's Phineas and Ferb, Candace Against the Universe. Next up, I'm going to be reviewing The Last Airbender, and then I'm going to be reviewing It. And finally, for the last segment, I'm going to talk about my top 5 Disney Channel original movies of all time. But right now, we're going to take a quick break.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have just given my review of Phineas and Ferb, Candace Against The Universe. Now I'm going to be reviewing M. Night Shyamalan's The Last Airbender, and finally, my weekly recommendation is It. And stay tuned until the very end of the episode where I talk about my top 5 Disney Channel original movies, or DCOMs, of all time. But right now, I'm talking about The Last Airbender, and this is because I had never seen the show before. It came on Netflix, I think, in like May, so I decided to binge the whole thing. Was blown away. It truly is one of the best, probably the best show made for kids of all time. Minus like Sesame Street, but that's a whole different realm. But The Last Airbender is a phenomenal television show. I just missed it for some reason, and I felt like I needed to be sort of like initiated into the fandom of Last Airbender by watching the movie. And I knew what I was going to get myself into. I'm sure that you guys, if you guys are really big movie fans or big TV show fans, you probably know what the general consensus over The Last Airbender is, and that it's not very good. So I knew that I was going into it like that. I wanted to still view it objectively, like not in reference to the show. Clearly, when you're adapting source material, I think you should look at the source material to see that it keeps the same tone, relatively a similar vision, but makes some necessary changes to a new medium. So I was looking at it through that lens, but not from necessarily like a fan lens. Oh, they did this wrong, because I don't think that's how you should view an adaptation. I think it needs to change to be really good. That being said, a lot of the changes that were made were not very good. And so instead of coming up with my own synopsis, the television show's intro, if you're not a fan of the show, haven't seen the show, is a perfect encapsulation of what the story is about. It's not lyrically based, it's just a monologue. So here's my best dramatic reading of the intro to Avatar: The Last Airbender. Water, earth, fire, air. Long ago, the 4 nations lived together in harmony. Then everything changed when the Fire Nation attacked. Only the Avatar, master of all 4 elements, could stop them. But when the world needed him most, he vanished. 100 years passed, and me and my brother... Oh, I messed that up. Sorry. And my brother and I discovered the new Avatar, an airbender named Aang. And although his airbending skills are great, he has a lot to learn before he's ready to save anyone. But I believe Aang can save the world. Mae Whitman did a much better job than I did. She voices Katara in the show, and that's who does the monologue. But that's basically the general premise. So it's a very obviously creative story. How the story actually evolves throughout it has excellent character work and development. Insane world building and research. The world building is by far my favorite part of the show. It's all based on different Asian cultures. Every bending style, every different nation is based on a specific type of either martial arts or other nation, obviously, because it's kind of a fictionalized world, but has its roots here in the real world. So I was definitely curious about how the movie was going to adapt it. This one is just called The Last Airbender now, but at the time I think it was called The Last Airbender Book 1, because it was supposed to be a trilogy. It was supposed to be each season of the show, which, here's the thing, when you adapt certain things like comic books or whatnot, or books, very telling that I started with comic books and not books, even though books are significantly more common to adapt. When it's like a different medium, adapting it to a film, a visual medium, is going to change things drastically, and I think there's a reason to do that. But here, it was a television show that's now a movie being condensed, so the only real difference is animation to live action, and given what this story entails, a lot of this is much better fitted for animation, and I think saying that it needs to have a live action adaptation discredits what animation really can do. But that being said, I was definitely curious to see it condensed into one movie, create a more concise story, and maybe focus some of that world building character work that had already been done and make a compelling sort of like 3-act structure, not in the sense of the television show. But I have to say, I can't say I was disappointed, because I was expecting it, but this movie is very, very not good. I don't know if I've reviewed a movie that I think is worse on this podcast. I think this is probably up there with one of my least favorite movies of all time. Because not only is it a bad adaptation of the source material, that's one thing. If that had happened, sure, maybe give it like a 5 or a 6. This is just an all-around poorly made movie. There's really no aspect of this movie that is well done. I don't want to sit here though and just like knock down this movie because everyone has already done that. No, I've not heard a single opinion about this movie that's good. So I will try and like tell you the parts that is good. Because although they're few and far between, there are some things that I do have to give this movie credit for. I think sometimes when a movie is bad, people will bash things that are even like mediocre or fine or good in some circumstances just because if one thing is bad, everything is bad. I don't think that's the case. I do think most things in this movie are very bad, but there are a few good things. None of those good things come from the screenplay though. So that's where I'm starting. In taking a television series, so this is just the first season, it basically takes the first act of this movie, probably a little bit less than the first act of the movie, but a good chunk of the beginning of this movie is just the pilot, so just the first 40 minutes of the series, and then the last act of this movie is the last like 4 episodes of the season. So they're basically condensing 18 episodes into like 45 minutes, an hour maybe. And a lot of season 1 is, I wouldn't say filler, I think they're all necessary, but not nearly as exciting or plot driven as the beginning and the end of the season. So it's not necessarily bad that they're condensing that the most. The problem lies in that almost all of the character development comes in those 18 episodes. So they're throwing a lot of the character development to the wayside, and I think they should have and could have found that character development in other places. But instead they just try and like really fast track the plot, and they try and fit certain episodes of the show to fit into the movie instead of making sort of like their own idea of what the plot should be for this film, which would have been a lot better of a choice to go, because obviously you're making like a new thing, and trying to condense something that is way longer isn't really going to work. I also think that the script expects a lot of the viewer. It expects the viewer has seen The Last Airbender. I had actually seen this movie a long time ago, like when it came out basically. So I was much, much younger, and I didn't have as critical of a lens when watching movies. But even then I hadn't seen the show, and it's just a very difficult movie to follow. I had no idea what was going on. I think the show does so much legwork for this movie that it expects you to get all of the character development from the television show, which is not something that an adaptation should do. It should be able to work on its own. And even still, even though it's expecting a lot, almost all of the dialogue in this is exposition. It's almost all trying to build up the world that we are in and then trying to build the plot forward. Not a lot of it is character based. We have no reason to care about these characters other than the show. So all of the dialogue is basically like, we need to get here, we need to do this needs to happen to stop this. It's just all kind of back and forth of like what is happening and what needs to happen. It's also just like kind of plain. It's very boring. Because it's all exposition, it sounds like diplomacy. Like, it's just a lot of boring jargon, people talking about the world that they're in, which is a very interesting world, but when there's nothing interesting happening, there's not much that the world building can do. And there's not a lot of world building that this movie does. It's all the show that they're kind of taking credit for, more or less. There's also a lot of narration from Katara, which doesn't really happen in the show, other than the, obviously, intro, which they have the intro in the movie, but they don't have the dialogue, which would be really cool if there was an excellent score over it. The score is ultimately like a watered down version of the score from the show, so it just becomes kind of flat without the narration, and it's already kind of a weaker version of it, and then it has a slow crawl where you have to read the narration. It just would have made a lot more sense to do the narration there or not have it at all. And you could have that intro with no narration, have it be like an epic thing. I think that would have been really cool, and then build up where the story's going from the movie itself and not have to like tell it to the audience in the same way that you might have to do for a kid's show. So I thought that was not all that great. The narration kind of is distracting and doesn't really help, and it's also kind of boring. Also, I think there's so much in the third act, because the third act is those last couple episodes, like the finale of the season. And so in the finale of the season, it's a huge build up to what we've been understanding. Whereas in the movie, we're just suddenly in this place and it's a big action set piece that we've really not established, the relationship between the characters and the stakes that are really going on here. What's funny too is that there's also a lot of necessary setup to like later seasons in those kind of middle episodes that they don't address at all in the movie, and so it doesn't matter because they didn't make more movies, but if they were attempting to, they miss a lot of the necessary setup. A lot of the dialogue too, like between characters, is just laughable. Like, it's just so poorly written. What's really hard, this is actually kind of feeding into the acting. When things are not very good, it's so hard to analyze because it's just not good. Like, there are parts that you can pick out that make it not very good, but it's just bad. It's just not very good, and that tends to be the acting. It's so hard for me to analyze the acting because it's just flat, one note, boring acting. Nobody has any life to them. There's no sort of like vibrancy. Part of the reason the show is so good is because the characters are so drastically different and exciting and charismatic. And in this show, they're so like plain. They also have like the basis of what the character is from the show and then make that their like archetypical character and then don't go beyond one dimension for the movie. So like in the show, mostly Aang is sort of like this positive force for a lot of it, but then in the movie, he's just sort of like happy and light and says everything like a server who's trying to get an extra big tip tonight. There's no kind of like depth behind it. Katara is the motherly figure, so she's just motherly the whole time. She doesn't have her own depth to her. Sokka, in the first season, Sokka is much more sort of like hard-hitting, masculine, or at least he's like trying to adhere to this version of masculinity that's like much more warrior based, and that is the case here, but he doesn't have any of the sort of like fun traits that he has in the show that add depth to him, that he's like trying to be something he's not. In this, it's just sort of like he's this flat, boring, intense character for no reason. This is something that a lot of people say all the time, is that the pronunciations are off. I do think that like not all of them I hate, because there's a level of like the show created this thing clearly, but there are some pronunciations that like, whether it's how the movie pronounced it or not, might be more accurate. I don't actually know. Obviously, I'm not an expert on all of these names. They come from the cultures that they're based on. But something like in the show pronounced Iroh, here it's pronounced Iro, and maybe should have pronounced like Ito, something like that would make sense. I also see like Aang and Ong are like, Ong doesn't really piss me off all that much. It seems like it would fit here. Sokka, maybe not. It just, sometimes it seems like they're trying to do it to differ from the show, whereas doing it to like enhance the pronunciation might have made sense, but here that doesn't really seem to be the case. It just seems like they're doing it to be different, where they could have done it to maybe like correct some pronunciation, which I don't even know if it needed correcting, but if it did, that's where they could have done it. also a part of the acting, and ultimately a part of directing and choreography. The bending is a big part of the show, obviously. So every nation has their version of bending. They can either bend fire, earth, air, wind. Did I say that? Fire, earth, air, fire. Wait, water. Sorry. Very lost. I thought I said all of them. But in the show, it's very exciting. It has a lot of movement. It's animation, so it can kind of go anywhere. And in this, the movements for it tend to be very slow, or they tend to be really quick, but the actual bending is really slow. So there just doesn't seem to be any stakes, and everything kind of falls emotionally flat. Which is kind of disappointing, because I actually do think something that this gets criticized for sometimes that I don't think it deserves, that I think the visual effects a lot of times are pretty good. I think even Appa looks pretty good, the giant flying bison, for what it is, for 2010, 2012. I think it looks great. Momo maybe is a little bit weaker, but I think that, like, the floating water and the earth and the fire, I think it actually looks really good. So it's disappointing that it's not quite as fast, and I think that has to do with the CGI budget. So moving on to production design, which is where some of that falls, I think that it takes pretty much all of the necessary production design from the show. So every nation is based on a different nation in our society, Earth, not our society, Asian cultures. And so I think it takes a lot from that. You can also tell that a lot of the casting, I think, does fit with the ethnic races, except for the main characters. Pretty much everybody is white for some reason. I know that a lot of this is kind of reiterating what a lot of people have said for a long time, but it does, not to necessarily get political here, but it really does seem like all of the major speaking roles are white, except for the villains, who are much darker, which is strange coming from a director of color, from M. Night Shyamalan. So that seems to me like it was a lot of studio-based things. They do, to be fair, look like the white version of them in the show, so they do look like their counterparts, kind of, but it is definitely disappointing that we don't get to see more representation, particularly something that is made for different races that are not white. The other thing, too, that is a little bit odd is that the Fire Nation is based on Japanese characters, and most of the people that are playing them are Indian. I'm a big fan of Dev Patel, and a lot of this I don't think would have mattered if not everybody was white, like everybody else was white. So that's just generally kind of like a downside to this movie. It's just very disappointing. Also because all the acting is bad. I think it would have gotten much more of a pass if it was good. People still would have criticized it, rightfully. But if there was good acting, sure. But it's like they didn't even get good actors for these roles. So they're inaccurate and bad. But the production design, a lot of the costumes are pretty accurate to the show, accurate from the culture that they're based off of, as far as I'm aware. I think the makeup actually looks pretty good. I like Zuko's scar. I like how it looks much more natural than it does in the show. I also really love Aang's tattoos. I'm going to pronounce it from the show, by the way, not how the movie pronounces it. I love his tattoos. I like how it looks a lot more naturalistic than it does in the show. It's not like glowing until it has to. I like how they're very much like tattoos that build this thing. So I think that looks really great. And then I did say that the VFX look really great. I think the main production design thing that I don't love is that a lot of the landscapes are kind of boring. They show this shot of the Fire Nation at one point, and it just looks like the Midwest, like with a couple industrial buildings on top of it and desaturated. So that doesn't really look all that interesting visually, which is disappointing. And then, so that kind of goes into the cinematography too. A lot of the scenes aren't all that visually interesting. They're either too dark and desaturated, or nothing is all that exciting around it. The space is much more open so that there is room for people to bend, but then the bending looks boring, so there's just no real purpose for it. There's also, this is one of those examples of no rhyme or reason to when you move to a cut. There's tons of cuts that are like close up, but it's not supposed to be intimate or ominous, and you also can't see what's happening in the background, and you need to see what is happening in the background. It just feels like too intense for some reason. There's a lot of like really close up two shots for some reason, which seems very odd to me. So there really doesn't seem to be any justification for when they're moving to a specific camera angle. The editing is very strange in this movie. It is one of the worst parts of the movie. The movie is paced extremely strangely. In some places, it's very slow, like the first two acts, and the third act moves really quickly for some reason, like they're rushing the ending. but then there are also moments in those fights where it's pretty slow. The bending is slow, so that kind of has to do with the editing. It's also structured really poorly, like I said. Too much is focused on the beginning and the end of the season. There's not enough character building in the middle, so the middle chunk just feels both really slow and really rushed at the same time. There's also really strange cuts, like just basic editing skills and basic filmmaking skills of knowing when to cut on action, or ending a scene, or not ending a scene too early, or not ending a scene too late, or not ending a scene when somebody is moving, or not fading to a different angle of the same thing. It's just like there are very odd choices that are being made here that really just go against the grain of everything you would learn in film school, which isn't a bad thing if you're doing it for a reason and subverting expectations. But here it just seems sloppy, lazy, and uninformed, ultimately. The sound, too, I think is relatively generic. It just feels like an action score. It doesn't feel like there's any real influences from the show. There are some minor things of instrumentation, but it just doesn't seem to flow in the same way that the show would. The show, actually, the scores of things, at least early on, is one of the weaker aspects, because it's really hard to make a score for a television show when it's coming out weekly, because every episode gets kind of rushed, and musicians really only have like a week, a couple days to make 20 minutes worth of music. So that's one of the places where the show isn't as strong as some other spots until later on when they get the groove more. And even still here, it's just much more generic, much weaker. There's no motifs going on for any character, for any conflict that does happen in the show, even when musicians were under that time constraint. So, and then finally, I'm a M. Night Shyamalan apologist. I think he's really good at making stories a lot of times. I don't think he's all that good at dialogue writing. There are things that he's much weaker on. I think one of the things that I praised a while ago Mark Webb for was group work. So a lot of like big extras, a lot of big scenes like that. I think M. Night is not very good at things like that. So here, there just doesn't seem to be any real emotion with the acting, and I think a lot of that not only has to do with some of the casting, but I think also has to do with some of the directing. There's also these big group scene works where characters are not looking in the right direction, or doing things that don't really make any sense for the scene. There's also just no real choices that differ from the show that aren't removing things, other than like those name choices, which is just a poor choice. There just doesn't really seem to be any sort of creative vision from M. Night that differs from the show. It seems like he's kind of just like taking everything from the show and trying to make it work into live action instead of having to tell his own story, which would have been a lot better. I also have to say there's probably a lot of studio interference that happened in this movie, so maybe not all of it is his fault. I don't want to pin all of that on him, because I think he gets a lot of hate for no real reason sometimes, but I do think that this is not one of his strongest outings. It is pretty darn bad, and he is at fault for a good amount of it. So I'm sorry about that. It's not all your fault, M. Night, but overall, I know you've heard this before. It's not a very good movie. So I'm going to give this one a soft 2 out of 10. That might be my lowest score. Tell me if it is. I don't remember. But yeah, it's not a very good movie. I would only check it out if you want to sort of like hate watch something, or in the mood for something boring to put you to sleep. There's no real reason to watch it other than that, or to like make fun of it with your friends, which is something that I did. So that's The Last Airbender. I'm sorry that I can't recommend that movie to you, but next up is something that I can recommend to you and is genre-wise very different. So that movie is It. That's my weekly recommendation, and then stay tuned until the very end of the episode where I talk about my top 5 Disney Channel original movies of all time. But right now, we're going to take another quick break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have just given my reviews of Phineas and Ferb, Candace Against the Universe, and The Last Airbender. Those are two separate movies, just by the way. And now I'm going to be reviewing It. And finally, stay tuned to the very end where I talk about my top 5 DComs of all time. But right now, we're talking about It. And I know it's a little bit weird to be talking about in this episode. But it's just that I wanted to pick a movie that was like kind of kid-centric, I guess. And it just so happened I wanted to do one based on a television show that was like a kid show, but couldn't find a good one that I wanted to recommend. And it just so happened that I got to attend sort of like this webinar, I think they call it, with the screenwriter of It, or one of the screenwriters of It, Gary Doberman. And I was really excited about that. So I thought this would be a great one to recommend, especially because we are like a month out from October, and I just want to let you know that all of October, I'm probably only going to be talking about horror movies. So I'm a big horror movie fan. So this is like a little precursor. This is my little like taste for horror coming up soon. But I'm a huge fan of this movie. I saw it when it came out, so like 2017. I saw it in theaters. I was oh wait, I meant to say about the talk with Gary Doberman. He didn't talk about It nearly as much as I wanted him to. He mainly just talked about like his career and stuff, but it was still definitely fun, and I got some insight into the movie regardless. But I'm a big fan of this movie. I thought it was super fun. I saw it in theaters with my friends. It was just a fun theater going experience, and so I thought it'd be a great thing to talk about. I'm sure you guys know it, but it's based on Stephen King book title of the same name. It's changed a little bit, so the book and the miniseries took place in the 50s. This one takes place in the 80s because we're coming towards the end of it, but at the time we were in the thick of 80s nostalgia. But it's basically a bunch of kids in a northeastern town who are being terrorized by a killer clown, who also might be an alien entity, and none of the townsfolk believe them because he's only hunting kids. So they have to defeat him before he comes back every 27 years. I guess that matters, kind of, for this one. Not as much for this one, definitely for the second one. But they have to defeat him on their own because none of the parents believe them. So, fun premise, exciting story. I have not read the book. I have seen the miniseries. I have to say that I like this version better. I know a lot of people like the miniseries better, but I think that probably just has to do about when I watch them and the generation that I'm a part of. But I'm a big fan of this movie. It's just super fun, and so let's talk about why. I think this is one of those movies that doesn't take itself too seriously, which some movies I think it makes sense for them to take seriously, but a movie like this, particularly horror movies in general, I think a lot of horror movies fall into this trap of like, we're scary, so we also need to be serious. But first of all, this is something that Gary Doberman talked about. The line between horror and comedy is so thin because of the fact that they're both sort of like a shock response in a sense. But not a lot of movies lean into the comedic factor of things because a lot of viewers and filmmakers and people in general just view comedy and horror as two very different things, even though I really think they're two sides of the same coin. And so I really like when a horror movie, even if it is a serious horror movie, like the Evil Dead remake or Texas Chainsaw or Halloween, a lot of those slasher films, I think don't take themselves too seriously. They know that the premise is a little bit goofy, and that is sort of why it's scary to begin with. And so I really like when horror movies kind of lead into that goofy side, the kind of comedic side at times. Sometimes it's not even comedic, it's just a little bit sillier. And because of that, because they're not taking themselves too seriously, you as a viewer are left like a little bit unguarded in a sense, and so it makes things even scarier. And then when things do take themselves too seriously, a lot of viewers I think can see through that, and it ends up just not being all that scary anyway. So I really like how this movie kind of leans into it, and because it's from the perspective of the kids, it's really great to see kids just like being goofy middle schoolers and like having fun while also being terrified. It really has a fantastic balance between the comedy and the scares. The beginning of the movie doesn't have too many scares. It has an excellent introduction to Pennywise. Most people know it from either the miniseries or the newer version, but the scene with Georgie, I think, is really just a fantastic introduction to this version of Pennywise. The balance between the silliness of the character and also the like sheer immediate terror of it all. So a great introduction, but after that there's really not all that many like jump scares, scary moments for a little bit because they want to establish those characters. And then when we do get back into the scares, it really goes back and forth between the kids not taking it all that seriously in the sense of like making jokes, or their responses to it are kind of funny and goofy. And then there's also just scenes among them that are kind of like silly and much more comedic, either based on sort of like their interactions or their actual kind of more quippy dialogue. And then so it goes back and forth between some like really scary moments and then some really fun comedic moments. And then the climax is just ultimately a very fun, almost action packed, exciting finale. So it really kind of goes between those lines of the genre in a really nice way. It doesn't feel like it's discombobulated. It kind of flows seamlessly into genres that fit really nicely together. And so going back and forth, you never know when to be scared and when to be like laughing. And so you're kind of doing both all the time, which I think is a really great way to approach a movie like this. Because it's going back and forth between those genres all the time, having different story beats to propel the story forward and not kind of like relying on whatever genre it is just to be enjoying the scene is necessary. And all those story beats create some really nice reveals, especially in some of those more scary moments. I mentioned earlier how there's a lot of character work in the beginning. I think the character work is really excellent. It really builds the distinction between all these different characters. There is kind of like 7 or so main characters, but you really kind of only focus on a couple of them. And so it's nice that we're focusing mostly on a couple specific characters, but we get a sense of all of the other ones, and they all work in tandem really well. And then the ones that we're supposed to be focusing on, we do get some like more solo, quieter moments between them, or just them by themselves. So we get to build all that character. And then that feeds into the acting, where all of the kids, because it's really focused on the kids, have insane chemistry. Like, you really feel like they're a group of friends and a group of kids that have their own conflicts, but they also have really enjoyable times. It really feels very nostalgic. It feels like how you might have been in middle school with all of your middle school friends, dealing with bullies and dealing with like rising hormones. And there's just so many different things going on to create a really kind of intricate group dynamic. And not only is the chemistry really great, but the casting is so well done. There's a great balance of kids who we might be somewhat familiar with. I think Finn Wolfhard actually filmed this before the first season of Stranger Things, because I know this got filmed a little bit before it came out. So great foresight there, first of all, because I think this came out like right after the first or second season, first season I think of Stranger Things. So there's a really great balance between people who we might already know for kids, like some more child star people, but then ones who we don't know at all, who we've never really seen before. And then that kind of goes with the adults too later on, whether it be the adults in this movie or even the adults in part 2. So having it balanced between sort of like people that we're already kind of familiar with, that invites us into the story, and then we get some unknowns with some really great acting chops that make us like really interested in the rest of everybody's stories. So I think the casting is really fantastic. It's just really fun to watch them interact with each other, and their reactions are so great. Like different reactions, whether it be like over the top, like yelling and screaming, or like having fun action scenes trying to beat up this clown, is just so entertaining to watch every single time. And the clown, Bill Skarsgård, is impeccable. His performance is absolutely dynamite. It's like the perfect balance between being extremely menacing, like terrifying, skin crawling, with different things that he can do with his mouth and his eyes. He has great physical acting in this. You can tell that he's really refined in his skills, and he's not focused on just sort of like what a lot of film actors tend to do sometimes. I actually don't know Bill Skarsgård's background, but a lot of the more physical acting tends to come from theater actors, because it has to be a lot more physical because you're not quite as close to them. And so I don't know if that is the case for Bill Skarsgård. I don't know if he's a theater background. He might not, and he might be taking, just for example, and learning it from different people. But I think that he has great physical body movements. Certain film actors don't do that, rely on dialogue, rely on kind of their facial expressions, and he relies on really every aspect of his body that he can as an actor. And so I think that just shows the talent that he has. And not only is he menacing in that, right, but he also has that balance of goofiness, that it's like, it's a killer clown that is also 3 beams of light from an ancient extraterrestrial being. Like, it's just like kind of already a silly thing. And so you get the different balances between like being really menacing and being kind of fun and goofy, and it can switch on a dime. So it's really great to see his performance. And what's really cool is that you can't really separate this performance with the character. It's like you look at Bill Skarsgård outside of the makeup, and the makeup obviously helps, but you're like, that's not Pennywise. That's like a normal dude. And then in the movie, it's like, oh, that's Pennywise. Like there really is no separation, which is really awesome to see. You forget you're watching an actor even though you know it's not an actual killer clown, which is really kind of awesome. And speaking of that makeup, the design is really great. It takes kind of, I don't want to say homage, but it definitely takes inspiration from that original series. It has different elements that are somewhat similar to it, but it kind of ups the stakes a little bit. I think the one from the miniseries is much more of a natural looking kind of clown makeup, and this one tends to be a little bit more sort of like intense in certain aspects of it. It's also a very different look, so it's not relying on what the miniseries did before it, because the miniseries look is so iconic. I think there are some moments where the CGI is a little bit much. I would have wanted maybe a bit more like natural prosthetics for Pennywise, but I do think that the CGI works in a lot of the regards. The makeup, I think, complements it fairly well in a lot of circumstances. And the CGI overall is really pretty good. I think there's some really creative scares that happen here, like where they happen, what they are, because the miniseries has already done certain things. The miniseries, I think, is a lot more varied, and the book itself is a lot more varied as to what the kids are scared of. This one is a little bit more centralized. I think it feels a little bit more specific, almost like they're kind of scared of different things at times in this one. I do think that the design of a lot of the creatures that tend to scare the kids are similar. It's a lot of just like darkened, exaggerated eyes and big sharp mouths. Like that's kind of a lot of it. That's much more of an offense in the second movie. There's a little bit more creative design in this one, but I think overall the design sometimes can be a little bit lackluster, but overall I think the scares itself are really creative. I think when Pennywise comes out of the refrigerator and he's like contorting his body, looks insane. So I think that overall the CGI and the production design worked really well here, even though it could have been improved, I think, in some aspects. This is one of those movies that you wouldn't expect some of the more technical aspects to be as intricate, but I think there are some awesome moments here from the cinematography. I think it uses shaky cam really well in association to Pennywise to enhance your experience, kind of like from a scare horror sense of it all. So it uses that really well. It uses the low angle extremely well because it's kids' perspective. So I think having a lot of either adults or Pennywise himself being at a much like higher look when you're looking at the screen, so from a lower angle, I think is a really smart choice to make you kind of be in the shoes of the kids. I also think that there's some really creative dolly shots here, whether it be like a kind of flyover of dairy or the kids on their bikes. I just think that there's some really nice kind of like more expansive establishing shots that look really good here. But really the shaky cam and the low angle, I think, establish what the narrative visual voice of this film is, which I think is really excellent and doesn't tend to happen in mainstream big budget horror movies. I also think there's some really good scare reveals. I think that tends to happen. The movie, I think, relies a bit too heavily on jump scares sometimes, but I'm not somebody who hates jump scares. I do think that they're effective, and I think when they're done well, they're done well. I think a lot of times they're done well here. Sometimes they get a little bit repetitive, but I don't think that it's cheap at all just to have a jump scare. I think it's only cheap if that's the only thing you're relying on, but I don't think that's the only thing this movie's relying on. So I like when the jump scares happen, and I think the quick reveals of things look really good. I remember in the theater, there's once, if you haven't seen the movie, there's this one scare where it's this kid like holding eggs, and you only see the top half, or you only see the bottom half of his body, and he's walking down the stairs, and then he like steps into frame where you should be able to see his head, and he has no head, and then there's a big music cue, and I thought that was not only like really creative, but I thought that having the reveal be through the camera was really great, and then that absolutely scared the hell out of me. Like I thought that was terrifying. That entire scene, I thought, like, I was on edge that whole scene. That was the scariest scene by far for me. I get scared pretty easily too, so I had a lot of fun. The editing, there's a really good balance, I think, of going back and forth between the different kids that we're supposed to be focusing on. I think it is really focused and centralized on which kids we're supposed to be focused on. I think what's really nice too is that some of the like more side characters, so Finn Wolfhard and Jack Dylan Grazer, who, side note, Jack Dylan Grazer I think is one of my favorite up and coming actors. I think he's really great, really talented, extremely funny. But I think both of them have some great chemistry, and they're kind of the comedic relief of everybody. So having them be in the movie just enough to want more is a really solid choice here. I don't think they overstayed their welcome at all. And I like how we focus on the main characters to a point, but we also get to have these sort of fun moments, but they don't get too much that we're exhausted of all these kind of more comedic moments. And then the pacing, I think, goes really nicely. It starts a little bit slower to establish the characters. The middle chunk where they hit their kind of lowest low is a really great scene. Every time I say lowest low, it's like I'm about to say Lois Lane. I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't say that, but that's like a common phrase. It's supposed to be talked about in movies. Anyway, that middle chunk where you get a lot of those jump scares, I think is pretty effective, even though it might get somewhat repetitive. It's much more repetitive in that second one. I think it is done pretty well overall here. And then the climax ties everything together thematically with all of the genres that it does. So it's not only funny in some ways, it's also really scary in a lot of senses, but it's also really action-packed and feels like an adventure movie like The Goonies, like an 80s movie kind of. So I think that part is really great. The sound, too, is, I think I take it for granted now, it's like iconic at this point. Having a horror movie score be iconic is it's no stranger. The genre is no stranger to having iconic movie scores. But in a movie like this, where a lot of mainstream big budget horror movies are just not all that well made, or just kind of like lazily put together because it's an easy way to make money, you're always going to get young kids who want to go get scared to see a horror movie. But having such an intense, memorable score in this that also serves the story in a way that like adds intensity and like adds to the dramatic effect of it all is insane to me. The score is one of the best parts of an already fantastic movie. So I really, really love the score here. And then the directing, I think that, so this movie is directed by Andy Muschietti, who, this is kind of his big thing. He had done a movie called Mama that got a good amount of viewership. It had a pretty good box office, but I think that kind of goes with the genre. It didn't get all that great reviews overall. I didn't actually see it, but this one is sort of his big outing, and you really get the sense that he knows how to have fun. Like, it seems like he's working with the kids in a really nice way. They're building chemistry seemingly on and off set. You can tell because it just translates onto the screen. He's not taking this movie too seriously in a way. It doesn't seem like he has a big ego. Every aspect of the film is playing a really integral part of this movie. There's also just a lot of heart in this entire thing. The story has way more heart than you'd expect from a movie like this. And so having that be kind of the umbrella that the whole movie is shaped in, I think is a really nice touch from this director. So I really like the directing in this too. Talking about this movie makes me like it even more than I put as my rating. I gave this movie a soft 9. I might give this like a solid 9. It's just a really excellent movie. Probably one of, if not my favorite horror movie to come out in the past couple years. So definitely check it out if you haven't. Sometimes I keep saying this, but I'm not a huge fan of like the big mainstream horror movies. I think a lot of times they're cheap cash grabs, but if you thought that might have been the case for this one, I urge you to go check it out. I think it's really great. Hopefully I didn't hype it up too much. I think it's really just a fun ride, especially if you're somebody who's not necessarily a horror movie veteran. You just want to have like a fun but still sort of a bit of a scary experience. Maybe save this one for October, have fun with it, but definitely recommend it. One of my favorite horror movies, just period. So that's it, the 2017 movie. And if you stay tuned until our final next and final segment, I'm going to be talking about my top 5 favorite Disney Channel original movies. A little bit of a 180 from this movie, but that's going to be the list. So stay tuned for that. But right now we're going to take our final break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you're just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have just given my reviews of Phineas and Ferb, Candace Against the Universe, The Last Airbender, and It. So kind of all over the place. But right now, because it's sort of a beginning, I started out this episode wanting to talk about like movies based on kids shows. Thought it'd be fun to talk about some movies that are from kids channels, and I'm a big fan of the Disney Channel, or I was for a very long time. So these are my top 5 favorite Disney Channel original movies of all time. I know this might get a little bit heated because this is a very subjective list. I think sometimes a lot of these movies are not up to like movie quality, but they still have a very, very special nostalgic place in my heart. Big fan of these movies. I think they introduced me to movies in general, like legitimately. I don't think that's an exaggeration. I think these are some of the first quote-unquote films that I actually watched. And so I think in that case, I think they're really important. That being said, I think particularly among my generation, opinions can get pretty heated on this. So this is a very subjective list. I apologize. Also, like most days, it will be a little bit of a shorter list. I apologize. I tend to front-load these episodes and talk a lot about these movies. If you would prefer me to kind of shorten those earlier reviews and talk longer about my top 5 lists, let me know. Tweet us at GSMC_movies. I'd love to hear your opinions on that. I think like whenever I watch top 5 or top 10 lists, I want to know what the movies are as opposed to people talking about them as much. So that's why I tend to focus more on the reviews and less on this. But if you think that's not the way to go and you want to do it a different way, please let me know. But right now, we're going to talk about the list. And I actually didn't write any notes for this because I kind of wanted to like go off my head of what just my thoughts on these movies are. So yeah, let's do it. So number 5 is one of my, this is the one that I was obsessed with as a kid. So it's very subjective. I actually have no idea what the quality of this one is right now. But it's the 13th Year. It's one of the earlier Disney ones. I think it's like late 90s, early 2000s. And it's a kid who finds out when he's like 12 or 13 that he's actually a merman, and his legs start to grow into fish to a tail. It's just kind of fun. It's like goofy and silly. I think it has like just some cool like mystical magical element. I think for me, being like a young kid, mermaids are kind of always associated with like women and femininity, and so having it be like a guy made me want to be like a merman. I was like, yeah, this is cool. This is awesome. So I think in that way, it's kind of cool, kind of introducing like fantastical magical elements to little boys, which doesn't always happen. It tends to be girls who get focused on something like that. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think sometimes the fantastical magical elements of things are like not associated with masculinity, so I did like that. But that also might be looking into it too deeply. I was just really obsessed with this movie. I thought it was really fun, so that's why it's number 5. It's also number 5 because I wanted to have at least one movie on here that was not musical. I think that at a certain point Disney made us so like early on, like 90s, early 2000s, Disney Channel movies are not musical based for the most part. And so I think they kind of hit a certain point, really with High School Musical, that they made the switch to almost exclusively do musical movies, which some people might dislike. There's a really adamant hatred for musicals sometimes, that they might not be as mature. I actually think it's a great formula to introduce kids to movies, especially really, really young kids. So I like that formula. So the rest of this list is all musical movies. Might be the generation that I grew up in. I kind of grew up in the High School Musical era. So if you disagree with me, sorry, but I think it's the perfect formula to create a Disney Channel movie for young kids. But that's the rest of the list. And there's one movie that might not have kicked off the craze of it all, but definitely introduced that aspect, I think, and that one's the Cheetah Girls. So that's number 4. I think the Cheetah Girls is a super fun movie. The costumes are iconic. The music is great. It introduced, it was kind of the first pioneer of like having a young Disney Channel star that was in a ton of things. So like Raven Simone is like the head of this. She spearheads this movie. She obviously had That's So Raven. So she was like a personality along with just being an actress. And so it has some like great chemistry. It has some fun group dynamics. The drama is really fun to watch. So it's a really fun movie. It didn't necessarily start the whole thing of like, now we're going to just do musicals, but I do think it was sort of a precursor for that, and it should get some recognition for that, and so that's why it's number 4 on the list. Number 3 is one that I think does not get nearly as much love as it should. It's sort of underrated, which is why I wanted to put it on the list, and that's Let It Shine. I think it came out kind of towards the end of my Disney Channel career, but it's also one of the only that's not true. It is definitely not the only. They started to do this more, especially now. But it is one of the first, if not the first one, to have like rap and hip hop be the music that they go off of, which I think was really fun. I hope that wasn't my introduction to hip hop, but it might have been. I don't remember when this movie came out, like 2012, 2013 maybe. So maybe I was even too old for Disney Channel. I do have a younger sister, so I forgive myself a little bit for watching it a little longer than maybe I should. But I do really like this movie. It has Tyler James Williams in it, who is a actually fantastic actor. So the acting in this is also really good. It kind of fits the formula of like having a singing competition of sorts. But it also kind of mixes genres in a really nice way. A lot of Disney Channel movies only have one genre, and it tends to be pop. It's just like having a fun pop song or maybe a love ballad of sorts. And this one kind of goes into a lot of different genres. It's mostly pop. Everything is influenced by pop, but it kind of has like some fun like hip hop and some gospel, some influences there. So I like this movie a lot. I think it's very, very underrated. Doesn't get enough love as it should. So that's why it's number 3. Number 2 and number 1, I don't think are going to be much of a surprise. And I also don't think is going to be all that controversial. I think these are overall seemingly, I think, the 2 best Disney Channel original movies. I hope people don't disagree with me, because I also just like objectively think that's the case. So number 2 is a sequel, and it's High School Musical 2. Maybe people are surprised by this, but I think High School Musical 2 is by far the best High School Musical. I've rewatched them all pretty recently, so I have some authority here. But High School Musical kicked off that craze, and obviously it was a cultural like phenomenon. And High School Musical 2 just sort of like upped the stakes here. It changes the environment. It gives like more character development for people. The songs I think are more iconic, I have to say. I think obviously like Bop to the Top and what is it? Soarin'. I'm so wrong. I don't remember what it's called. The big song of High School Musical. But all of these ones are bangers. Every single song in High School Musical 2 is great. Some of the songs in High School Musical, I think, fall a little bit flat. High School Musical 2, not the case. Also, they're on summer vacation. They're just having fun. How is that not fun to watch? Also, High School Musical is like, they're going to the callbacks. It's not even like I think people forget that they're not actually in the musical yet. They're at callbacks, and the entire basketball auditorium goes to watch Troy and Gabriella's callbacks. Why? What's the point of that? My audio is spiking. I'm getting really heated here. But I think High School Musical 2 is definitely the best one. It's just fun to watch. The music is fantastic. And I think like all the acting in the High School Musical movies is actually pretty good. It's like has that balance of like being goofy, like dumb sort of Disney Channel acting and over the top, but it's also like a lot of them have gone on to do great things. They're actual like really good actors that started here or got their big break here. So it's really actually quite good. And I like the structure and the stakes of this movie. So I think it's really fun. So that's why it's number 2. It deserves to be number 2. And number 1, I've said this to a lot of people, and I don't think I've met anyone who's disagreed with me. I think the only Disney Channel movie that holds up as an actual movie is Lemonade Mouth. And so Lemonade Mouth is number 1. It is just like structured well. The chemistry is excellent. If you would release this in theaters and it was PG, I think it still would have done really well. I think it's based on a book. It has just like some phenomenal songs, some of the best songs that you're going to hear in any Disney Channel movie that are catchy and memorable. She's So Gone might be one of my favorite songs, period. It's definitely the best song to come out of any Disney Channel movie. You can quote me on that. I think it's better than any High School Musical song. It could be a radio hit. It could be a pop radio hit, and I don't think I'm wrong in saying that. I think Lemonade Mouth has like a really great message. It has some fun like themes. It has some great moments of Battle of the Bands. It like weaves in the music aspect in a really nice way. All of the kids in it have their own character. It's like a breakfast club of sorts. It takes inspiration from a lot of different places. I think that like all the actors are charismatic and have personality. It's just great. I think overall, if you've never seen a Disney Channel movie, this is the one to watch first. I think it is absolutely excellent, and I actually think it would hold up as a good movie. Maybe I'll review it at some point. I think I might. I'm curious to like watch it again without nostalgia goggles. I've watched it relatively recently, like within a year, within probably 2 or 3 years. But I think it's a genuinely very good movie. So that's why it's number 1. So that's my list. I had a lot of fun making that list. I had a lot more fun than I thought I would, and I had a lot of fun talking about it. And I just had a lot of fun making this episode. I hope that you guys are having fun. I hope that you guys are staying safe. I hope that you guys are liking my episodes. Let me know some of your thoughts. Let me know some like movie opinions, some things that you want me to review. Because if you hit me up with a movie that you have seen and like, or haven't seen, or I haven't seen, I will watch it and review it. I would love to do that. So please let me know. Tweet us at GSMC_movies. That's the one that we're checking the most. We're all on top of those. And as always, thank you so much for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Please remember to subscribe to the show if you haven't already. Also, leave us a nice review if you'd like, because that really helps us. If you could please remember to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I have been your host, Casey Baum. Thank you, and have a good one.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.